Hey, Jen, Andy Mangold from the Brass Herald. As I'm sure the administration knows, a lot of Americans are frustrated right now. I mean, they've been doing the right thing, and they're still getting punished. What does the president have to say to those out there that had to mull to 4, kept a 2-lander, and then never hit their 3rd land?
So my advice to everyone out there who's frustrated, sad, angry, pissed off, feel those emotions, go to a kickboxing class, have a margarita, do whatever you need to do this weekend, and then wake up on Monday morning, we got to keep fighting.
Hello, and welcome to Lucky
No. Oh,
okay.
sorry. Just you do you.
Hi, and welcome to Lucky Paper Radio. It's just me and normal guy. No fun voice or anything. We don't like that. This is why. Wait, how do I got all thrown off now. Welcome to Lucky Paper Radio. I am your host, Andy. I'm here with my co-host, Anthony. I just realized I didn't think of a nickname this week. I have a file of them, but
Oh, really?
This intro is off the rails already. So yeah, you don't get a nickname. Take that, tough buddy.
It's just me, just regular.
Just you,
guy.
Maddox. Anthony, just regular guy, Maddox. I think we actually did that one before because that was your tag name on the server for a while.
I was O1 guy for a little bit. Yeah.
O1 guy.
Mm-hmm.
O1 guy. Now what do we do small talk about at the beginning of the episode? I didn't do normally the nickname. Let me explain the structure of the podcast to you.
Okay.
Normally the nickname
podcast. I've never paid attention, so
normally the nickname is the introduction to a little get to know each other round where we just talk about normal stuff and we chit chat for 90 seconds, a couple minutes, and then we segue into the actual episode. But didn't have a nickname, so.
Well, last week you made everyone mad at me for not having oven mitts, and so I thought about making a list of all the things that I think are more important to have in a kitchen than oven mitts, but then I didn't do that.
How long is that? Actually, maybe you should do that list because you're not a kitchen maximalist. You don't have a bunch of kitchen gadgets, I would say.
I try to have the most value kitchen. Like a tool needs to pull its weight, but I do like buying kitchen stuff.
I would be interested if we both made a ranked list. Most important things in a kitchen in order, not including ingredients and food. Just how far off our ranking of pot holders or oven mitts would be. And to be clear, I'm a pot holder guy, not an oven mitt guy, but to me it's one and the same.
Goddamn pot holders.
They're fine.
Worst of both worlds.
Just wash them. If your only problem is that you don't wash them, that's a solvable problem. You just wash them more.
But will I wash them more?
Okay, look, you're right. I am the kind of person that approaches the world with that lens, where it's don't make it harder on yourself to do the thing that you want to do. And if you find it hard to wash oven mitts or pot holders or whatever, fine. I did not expect the extreme backlash that you received for your oven mitt take. I kind of thought more people would be like, Andy, why aren't you a cool guy like Anthony with a cool guy kitchen?
Nope.
Turns out,
not how it works.
I have the objectively correct opinion as taken from a random sampling of vocal listeners to our podcast. Perfect. We covered the small talk. This week on the show, Anthony, we are going to be talking about BattleBox. It's a Seuss Man special. What's up, Seuss Man? BattleBox topic coming at you. I know you guys want more BattleBox episodes, and we are doing it today because Anthony has updated his. What would you say? Would you even call it the same BattleBox? I mean, it's got a lot of similar cards, but this is a new BattleBox spiritually to you.
So I definitely, when I set out to make a big update from this list that I had years ago and kind of just hadn't played for a long time, my intention was to change it, and then there was just so much stuff I wanted to change. I did end up just starting the list from scratch, and then when I more recently actually got the list together in paper, just bought all the cards again. So I still have both boxes now. So
we'll call it a new
box.
Anthony has a new BattleBox, which was, it sounds like, inspired by your dissatisfaction with your old BattleBox when you came back to it after a couple years of it sitting dormant.
I mean, I wouldn't say it was not inspired by that, but I wanted to have access to it again. I mean, it's something that there had been some issues with it, so I just ended up not playing it as much as I wanted to. So set some very different goals for myself and rebuilt it in a new way.
Cool. And I also have a new BattleBox. I have put together a more focused BattleBox, which we'll get to, but I think we'll spend most of the episode talking about your BattleBox. And instead of a pack one, pick one, Anthony, we're going to try mix it up a little bit. This podcast is already all over the place. The intro was a total mess, frankly. 2 stars. So instead of doing a pack one, pick one from a listener submitted cube, we are going to do a hand one from your BattleBox. And I say hand one because we both play by the rules. You can't mulligan in BattleBox. So
correct.
This is just the hand you get. Anthony and I both drew hands at random from his new BattleBox, and we're going to rate them I guess 0 to 5 forks. All right. I have in my opening hand Applied Biomancy, Yavimaya Sap Herd, Monastery Swift Spear, and Fungal Plots. I think this is a great opening hand. I feel very good about it. I think Monastery Swift Spear is, on pure power level, one of the more powerful cards in the cube, and I can go Monastery Swift Spear into Applied Biomancy. Mind you, not Applied Biomancy on turn 2, because I will need to play a mountain to play the Monastery Swift Spear, so it has to be a turn 3 Applied Biomancy. But I feel like having a little bit of interaction for the board and a Monastery Swift Spear is a very good start already. Yavimaya Sap Herd is a decent creature. Fungal Plots, I gotta be honest, not thrilled to see that in my opening hand. It's not my favorite card in the battle box, and also not a card that's very good early. And so, to me, that's kind of a blank, and I'm hoping to draw some more action after my Swift Spear, Biomancy, Sap Herd start, which I think is ultimately pretty good. I give this hand 4 forks, I think.
I think I'm in the same spot with this hand. I'd be pretty scared of this. I totally agree that Fungal Plots is it's a little bit of a weird inclusion for this list altogether. I wanted to include, even though a lot of it is very much, creatures and combat tricks.
You can say it. You want to include Saprolings.
Well, yes, we'll talk about Saprolings. I wanted to include a couple things that are like an enchantment that sort of gives you this different access to try and plan your game plan around. It's interesting that I don't think it's super powerful, but at the same time, it's the card you have. Like, players don't, unlike a cube,
right.
Players don't have the opportunity to just draft this and say, I'm never going to play Fungal Plots. It's like, well, you only have so many cards. Figure out how to do the best you can with it.
What a great segue to mention our first episode of the podcast we did about Battle Box, which we will link in the show notes. One of the advantages we talked about there, Anthony, is that when you're designing a Battle Box, you actually do have full control over what cards your players will play with. When you're playing a cube, they could just not draft them, not put them in their deck, whatever. Putting a card in a cube does not guarantee it's going to see someone's hand in a game. Battle Box does. You just get dealt the card. I'm just going to play with Fungal Plots, which we've both discovered is a great way to get players maybe to push outside of their comfort zone and test their assumptions. If it's a card, like I don't like Fungal Plots in my opening hand. I'm rating it pretty low in this opening hand. Does trigger prowess. And maybe it turns out, come turn 4 or 5, I'm thrilled to have this Fungal Plots, and I am proven wrong. And that's a great place for Battle Box to shine. What's your opener, Anthony?
So my opener is Merchant of the Veil, Think Twice, Overgrown Armosaur, and Shipwreck Looter. I like this hand a decent amount as well. So you'll notice in this box, if you look at the list, the trend is overwhelmingly towards cheap things. So, things that cost 2-3 mana. So I'm actually just really happy to have a 5-drop. I know I'm going to be able to hit all of my lands. So being able to say I'm going to be able to play a big thing on turn 5 makes me feel good. I love having the Looter and the Think Twice. So I have a little plan to get that set up. Or maybe I'll probably just haggle the Think Twice right away, right off the bat.
Oh, really? You'll go turn 1 haggle?
Maybe not turn 1.
A turn 1 haggle?
So I probably won't end up going turn 1 haggle. It's a little bit tricky with the tapped land. So you have a set of 5 guild gates, 5 basic lands. I think probably the best way to use that is basically think of those land drops as 1 mana plays you can use at some point. And it might actually be better, especially with an overall slower hand, to turn 1 play a tap land, turn 2 play another tap land, plus the haggle. And I think that's the best way to set up this hand.
What if I propose a trade? My Fungal Plots for your Think Twice.
No.
I would like to have the Think Twice in the Monastery Swift Spear hand, please.
Yeah, that would make your hand... I think that would make your hand like an A+.
I would say A.
A?
I wouldn't
Okay.
say A+, but
Okay.
I would say A. It would be an A+ if I had a more reasonable curve. I guess at that point, you just go Swift Spear to Think Twice into Hold Up, Apply, Biomancy, or Flashback Think Twice. Yeah, it's a pretty good start. I like that to start quite a bit.
I'm almost, even with your hand, wondering if you should play a tap land turn 1 rather than just playing out the Swift Spear. Because the problem is turn 2, you don't have another 1-drop. So if you don't play a 2-drop, you're then just wasting a mana somewhere in there.
Well, I can always just cast Fungal Plots if I
That-
don't need
that is
to.
true. That
if
is
I don't
true.
need to
Yeah.
apply Biomancy something. Yeah, I don't know. This is a thing that context matters, Anthony. And
Really?
I often find myself in environments like this where the cards are lower power that I will play with more high-powered heuristics. So you heard me describe that, oh, well, this opener is great because I have Monastery Swift Spear and then an Apply Biomancy to back it up. And what I was thinking when I said that is this is a great opportunity to play a good 1-drop that will put some pressure on my opponent and then have an answer for their first creature, whatever it is. Just bounce it, do something to it, hit for more damage. In reality, it's
You're not playing the aggro deck. You're playing
right.
a proactive hand.
Right. In reality, I think the truth with Battle Box is that you very rarely are going to have opportunities to make those kinds of tempo trades where it's like, I don't care what you played. Even if you play a Shipwreck Looter, I'll just bounce it and let you loot again. Who cares? I guess you wouldn't be looting because it'd be your first play. But, whatever you played first, just bouncing it and say, who cares? I'll let you play it again and just get a tempo advantage. It's probably not as valuable as holding that Biomancy until a time where I can maximize the value of the card, because value matters a lot in BattleBox, a lot more than tempo in my experience. And so really I want that to be like a blowout in combat, where you double block something and then block something else, and I pump the thing you single blocked, and I bounce one of your double blockers, and it's just like a plague wind, basically. Like, that's how you win in BattleBox, I think. In which case, I wouldn't be holding up on turn 2. That would be a late game play anyway.
For sure. And I think Biomancy is, as far as like combat tricks go, kind of pushing the power level here.
It's pretty cracked.
It can really set up 2-for-1s pretty easily.
I think that Swift Spear and Think Twice are by far the most powerful cards in this pack. Now, to your point, Overgrown Armor Store is unique in that there are not that many 5-drops. And I noticed in our playing of this that there isn't a ton of target removal either. A lot of it is kind of soft removal, like bounce and that kind of thing. And so there's a decent chance you'll hit a 5-drop and then I need to like finagle some sort of creative way to get it off the battlefield rather than just like, haha, Doomblade.
Sure. I mean, I think there is a fair amount of interaction here. But a lot of it is, in terms of target creature gets -2/-2 or deals 2 damage. So yeah, there's definitely a smaller set of interaction that will actually deal with it. I think this is one of a couple cards that didn't actually make it to the paper list yet. So I don't think I've actually gotten a chance to play with this in this box. But
Do you need an Overgrown Armor Store, Anthony?
I've got one probably, and that's stack of junk that I'm looking at. But
can the coffers bear the expense of an Overgrown Armor Store?
There are two or three random cards that just I wasn't able to get through the TCG card optimizer that I have to go dig up manually.
So what's your rating in this hand overall?
I think mine is definitely worse than yours, but I'd still go with, are we doing forks? Is that what we're doing?
That's what I did.
I'm going to go with 3 forks. Middle of the road. It's maybe slightly above average.
I don't know. Looking at it again, and given the context we just talked about, I actually think your hand might be better than mine. You just have way more value. You've got guaranteed 2-for-1 in hand. You've got a 5-drop in hand. I have kind of pure tempo. I mean, you could call Sapherd a 2-for-1, kind of, but
the Fungal Plot's hand, pure tempo.
We didn't even talk about how in our language episode, we didn't talk about the nuance of calling something a 2-for-1, or that's a whole thing.
There's so much we didn't talk about.
That's a whole thing. I don't know. I think your hand might actually be a little better. I would like to live in a world where I get to beat you with a Swift Spear backed up with a combat trick, but I'm not sure I'm actually going to be able to punch through this hand with that amount of interaction.
I'm just looking ahead at the next 4 cards that popped up, and that's the hand that I want. Fireslinger, Nantuko Husk, Arcbound Tracker, and Jund Battle Mage. Nantuko Husk is like one of the most powerful cards in this box. I think it is always impactful every time it comes down, and I love that.
Really?
I wouldn't, well, not the most powerful, but it is. I mean, there's not a better way to say it than every time it comes down, it dominates the board, and the game becomes about Nantuko Husk, and I love that is the case in this context.
I feel like the game is going to be about Fireslinger. That's the card I'm most worried about.
I also love Fireslinger, and that it is really, really impactful here.
Yeah. I know what land you play first with that hand, unless you don't have black-red duels. I can never remember which ones you have.
Yep, you just got it to adventure.
You got to look down and figure it out. All right. Before we talk more about this BattleBox, Anthony, we should, now that we're 12 minutes into the episode, actually explain what the heck BattleBox is.
Great point.
Some of our listeners will not know what we're talking about, and they'll be very confused. So why don't you break them off a little explanation of BattleBox?
So BattleBox is a casual way to play Magic where traditionally both players are drawing from the same stack of random cards. There are no lands in the stack. Instead, you get to just play 1 land for free from, let's call it the command zone, and you have a set of 5 basics and 5 guild gates in some combination of colors. So, and your opening hand is 4 cards, no mulligans. Other than that, everything's the same. Usually players still have separate graveyards. The shared library is more of an aesthetic thing unless you have a lot of like scry or, effects that actually interact with the top of the library. But the point is you just have your box in your bag, you throw it on the table in between draft rounds or wherever you're playing, and just play a really quick, easy game of Magic with all kinds of, you're playing all 5 colors and all kinds of things can happen. Obviously, from that, you can change whatever you want. You can cut out colors.
And we'll see later. I've changed quite a few things.
The land rules. You could put lands in the back. I played one wild battle box that just had a huge array of crazy stuff and also had the Tron lands in the land set. So I just happened to draw a 7-mana colorless creature.
Where did you do this?
Oh, it was a while ago. So okay. I played my battle box with somebody at our local game store. And the next week, literally, they were like, I made a battle box. Check this out. And it was an experience, but it's a fun format, and I really appreciate that it is so like quick to pick up, easy to play a game that it can spread pretty quickly.
Yeah, and the TLDR on our introduction to BattleBox episode, which you don't have to listen to, but I recommend it, is that we like this a lot as a way to get to playing Magic very quickly. There's no draft. There's really no shuffling, frankly. I mean, if you keep your box shuffled and by its normal state, it's pretty randomized because, again, there's no land, so you don't have to worry about like distribution of a certain type of card being randomized. Like
you're not unshuffling it by drafting.
Exactly. You're not unshuffling it by drafting or playing, right? At the end of the game, you put your graveyard and your cards in play into a pile. Your lands are mostly in play. Your spells and creatures mostly in play. Anyway, the point is it's very quick, and we like it for that. We also really like it as a great sandbox for designing environments, whether they're cubes or battle boxes, because, again, you just force your players to play with these cards. They don't have to draft them, which takes out a whole layer of decision-making you have to analyze when you're building a list. You can also make it very, very small. My battle box we'll talk about at the end of this episode is only 100 cards. You can go smaller if you want. It doesn't really matter, which means there's a much lower barrier to entry to like just starting designing something. And then you just immediately start playing games and get to feel how these cards interact with each other and what the environment feels like. So we like them a lot. And now we should talk about what drove you to this new battle box, Anthony.
So there were a couple sort of, honestly, more than anything else, logistical issues with my first battle box. So what I really want it to be is this thing that I can throw in my bag, and, we're waiting for people to show up to actually fire the cube draft, or, we're doing F&M and there's time in between rounds, or we're waiting people to finish their round. And I just want to be able to grab the battle box and say, hey, let's play some quick games. The problem was I made the box way too big. I filled it with all kinds of cool foils that I wanted to double sleeve. I had 4 land sets to really maximize the potential of having everybody play it, and about 1 billion different kinds of tokens, all stuff that I love. But the result was it just even with a fairly small list of cards was a big box that I had to deal with. So just like very straightforward logistical changes, my new box is non-foil, so I can, and no valuable cards that I feel I have to double sleeve, which, that sounds kind of stupid, but that is what is important to me about this format.
And to be clear, your first box, I don't think had that many pricey cards in it, but they were foil and the curling can happen.
There were a couple weird old stuff that...
Sometimes cards just pop off.
Yeah.
I bet that Grizzly Fate's worth something now.
Oh, I don't think so, but I hope so. So another big change was I really held myself to a limit of only 3 different kinds of unique tokens, so I can just have a couple different tokens, and kept the size in check. So that was a big change. Was just it fits in a small box, it fits in a deck box, and I can bring it with me wherever I'm playing Magic.
I love the token restriction especially. That is one of the trade-offs in my own cube designs, most of my cubes, frankly, where it's like you just end up with a smattering of tokens that are kind of incidental based on the cards you chose for other reasons. And so often you have these tokens that just conflict.
Your 4/4 angel with vigilance, and then your 4/4 warrior angel with
That's an extreme example,
vigilance.
but even more simply, it's like just a 1/1 white creature. Could be a soldier, could be a human soldier, could be a warrior, could be a monk. That one has prowess. But like a lot of overlapping space where if they were designing a set, they would not have tokens that were so similar in the same set. But just by the nature of the fact that a lot of cube and battle box designs are pulling cards from the full history of Magic, you're like, I like this card and this card for different reasons. Oops, they make somewhat conflicting tokens. And that's the thing that in other environments I've worked on, I have just dealt with and kind of let that be a side effect of my other design values. But I really liked limiting of tokens here. It felt great. It was like, there's the 3 tokens I could possibly need.
Right. I mean, again, it goes back to the goal of I want this to be a quick pickup game. So here's the 3 tokens. We don't have to spend time digging around and finding the right one.
And talk about a great way to actually get your players to use tokens. There's only 3 of them. It's much easier to reach for, like that actual 5 seconds, 10 seconds shuffling through the token stack to find the one you need is a non-trivial barrier. It's a real barrier.
Right. Yeah, that's another little detail that we should mention is typically in battle boxes, there's no shuffling because obviously if you have a tutor effect, you could search through this huge stack of potentially hundreds of cards. That's just really not in the spirit of what we're looking for. Also, I mean, it would just take so long to look through the singleton pile and figure out what you're doing. So,
also, like I have always played my battle box as a separate deck, just because I feel like I get the like aesthetic thing of the one single deck. I feel like it feels like a fun novelty for players that have never done it before. And the other thing it does is it's a way of just guaranteeing that you haven't done something weird to like stack your deck and make it better. Like,
yeah,
like even though you could still draw the same cards from the same stack or some separate stacks, I feel like players would feel worse if they got to the end of the game and they were drawing from a separate stack and they felt like their cards were lower power level.
That is a
than
great
if they were
point.
drawing from the same stack. Then they're like, oh, it's just luck, as opposed to like, I had a bad deck and I had no chance.
So I love the shared deck, especially because it again just adds to that quick feel of I'm slapping this in the middle of the table, setup, done. There's nothing else we have to do. But I totally agree. I played a bunch of this with my brother, and I feel like it does change the texture of just the way you perceive those cards. Whereas we've talked about this challenge a little bit with lower powered cubes. Players often sort of blame their cards a little bit. If they're losing, they're saying, well, I'm just losing because I have these bad cards. Like I opened a pack, didn't have anything great to choose. When you're drawing from the same deck, it really makes it visible that, hey, we're both playing with the same cards.
Yes.
These cards are all bad.
Yes, it emphasizes the fact that there is no difference between your decks, which is always true, of course, whether you just split it in half or not. But it reminds them of that with every single draw step. That yes,
Right.
same deck.
So another big and related logistical change that I made is in the first iteration of my battle box, I really leaned into that shared deck and included a ton of cards that manipulated the top of the library. So think cards with scry that let you choose whether, how to order cards so you know whether or not you or your opponent is going to draw the card next. And to go really extreme things like Spire Owl that just let you reorder the top of the library. And it even got weirder than that, which it was. Well, what's this card? Just like lets you look at the top 5 cards and reorder them. And it was actually very fun to like, oh, my opponent does that, but they don't know that I have a cycling card.
I believe the card is called Index.
Index is a card. That is not. It's a card that costs blue-black.
Diabolic Intent? Is that what you're talking about?
No.
Diabolic Visions.
Diabolic Visions.
That's actually a very powerful card because you can repeat that process as many times as you want, if I remember correctly.
No, you're thinking of Limduel's Vault.
Oh, I'm thinking of Limduel's Vault. You're right. They're so similar and weird.
So many weird cards. Anyway, so I actually really enjoyed that aspect of the battle box, that there was this new sort of texture to the game of manipulating the top of the library. I thought that was a fun, novel space to explore. However, again, in sort of rethinking what do I want from this battle box, it's not that. I want to play quick, clean games of Magic. And as much as that experience was novel to like see someone's eyes light up and realize, oh, I get to stack the top of the library now, was fun and I enjoy it. I would do that again. I'm happy I explored that space. But I want to get back to something that's a little bit more just like these are good, quick, clean games of Magic, and that kind of novelty is not what I'm looking for.
Yeah, and the role I think those effects played is like you don't, again, have any control over what things you're going to draw or what things your opponent's going to draw, and that changes a lot about your sequencing, and you have to kind of just play face up with whatever you got. And what that effect allows you to do is actually make some sort of multi-turn plan or semblance of a multi-turn plan based on how you think you're going to stack the top of the deck, which is a whole nother mini game. It does introduce like a whole nother layer into the game, which is not present in any other kind of Magic, which is interesting.
Definitely.
And, I've enjoyed it playing in your original battle box. And when I built my first battle box, I did the same thing you did with your second, where I was like, all right, we have Anthony's battle box, which has tons of scry effects. I've done that. Now, what if we didn't do that? And the way I did it is I just said, let me separate the decks. And the reason I did that actually is because I didn't want to limit myself to no cards that had any scrying or manipulation at the top of the deck. Because like if you're going to play with the same deck and you don't want that to be a factor, you kind of, I think, have to just leave out all the cards that scry, because that becomes about that immediately. And so in order to allow myself to still have access to scry cards and stuff like that, I did just play with separate decks and basically avoid that altogether. You've played with your battle box a bit now. What have you learned, you feel like, from this second time around?
So overall, I would say I'm super happy with it. I think compared to... So if we actually get into the actual gameplay of it, there were some issues with the first one where the gameplay was a little bit too slow. So I had a bunch of effects that I was hoping, like, these are mana sinks, these are scalable effects. And the result was you kind of just sit and get max value from your cards. Like, you're never going to cast your kicker cards without kicker, things like that, which you mentioned at the top that it tends to be less about tempo and more about just how do you maximize value. And while I think that's probably still true to an extent, I feel like this iteration is much, much less true, where sometimes you do want to get that tempo play in. I mean, a really simple metric is you can just look at how long the games go. And in this box, the games generally go between turns 8 and 11. So it's,
and this is one of the only formats where you can actually keep track of that easily, because you play one land a turn. And so you can look at the end of the game and say, I've got 2 lands I haven't played. That was an 8-turn game. So
overall, I think that just works a lot better. And in addition, the mana sinks, I think, are working a lot better. And the way I accomplished that was largely just cutting down the mana cost of spells, so things are much cheaper.
Hell yeah, I love cheap cards.
Which means... Because another sort of weird aspect of this is when you're drawing this from this deck that has no lands in it, it's kind of like you're drawing 60% more cards, because every card is a spell you can play. Or, I mean, if you want to think of the lands that you're playing as an extra card, you're drawing 100% more cards than a normal game of Magic. So it's actually pretty easy.
It's a big part of the smaller starting hand size, right?
Right, but even with that, you can just end up with big hands. Like, you're just...
Big hands!
Yeah, like some horrible Michel Gondry nightmare. So really cutting down the cost meant that, well, now these mana sinks, I'm looking at Jund Battle Mage now, and I'm thinking, this is a great card. I'm going to be delighted to make a bunch of Saproings, whereas in the previous iteration, that just wouldn't come up because you still had, like, a
much
6 mana kicker spells to do, right? So I'm really happy with how that worked overall.
Before we move on the curve, you mentioned that tempo is more relevant here. I think I agree. I've only played a couple games of it, but it certainly seems that way, and the lower curve would definitely indicate that. I think people might not entirely understand why we say that it's really hard to play like aggressively and with a very proactive plan. And that's because, again, you have no control over what you're going to draw, and what you're going to draw is from a much wider set of things than in normal circumstances. Like, if you take an opening hand from a battle box and an opening hand from an aggro deck you drafted from a cube, it doesn't matter what cube, doesn't matter what aggro looks like, and these hands could be identical, right? Let's say the cube deck hand has 4 cards, it's got 2 cheap creatures, a removal spell, and a combat trick, and 3 lands. The battle box, you get the same 2 cheap creatures, the same removal spell, the same combat trick. The difference is that in your deck that you drafted if it's an aggro deck, you're only going to draw cards you put in your aggro deck. In the battle box, you could have a great aggro opener and then just draw running 4 and 5 drops or running creatures with defender. Like, you could just draw a bunch of cards that don't contribute to that strategy. And so, because being the more proactive deck often means basically trying to use all of your resources as quickly as possible before your opponent can, you can't guarantee you're going to draw more resources you can use to advance that game plan. And so I think even if the box is lower curving, unless it really, really goes hard on like an aggro hyper mirror or something, it's going to be hard to play that tempo role. And even in an aggro mirror, right, you're going to still, like, the way you win an aggro mirror is going bigger than your opponent, which in this case would probably be getting more value out of your cards than your opponent is if they're trading for tempo. So it ends up being, I think, a little bit challenging to be the proactive person in this format, just kind of by default.
Right. I mean, you can't just say, like you would in a deck that you drafted, like, oh yeah, I'm going to just attack you with a bunch of 2/2s when you have a 3/3, and it's fine that I'm losing some value because I know I'm going to draw more evasive threats. I know I'm going to draw a burn spell that can finish you off. So, my game plan is going to be to kill you before your cards matter.
You're just going to draw a steadfast armor sword.
You're going to draw.
Actually probably fine. You're going to draw.
You're going to draw a radical idea and be like, well, now my tempo doesn't matter anymore because I have this like slow draw spell, and that's just not going to work. So I did it related to that. Really focus on having a lot of unique and interesting types of evasion, so that and types of interaction that are maybe a little bit softer. So things like Frost Trickster or bounce spells that let you, without totally giving up on values, still find ways to make a plan of how am I going to get in and attack. Another thing that I focused on was just dialing in addition to the mana cost, just sort of the scale of the kinds of effects and like the power and toughness of creatures. And I think that's working out really well as well, where Overgrown Armosaur is a 4/4. There aren't a ton of 4/4s here. You're going to see a lot of 3/2s and 1/1 flyers and 2/1s. And just keeping everything in a scale relative to each other, I think it just is creating really good gameplay. Like we talked about Fireslinger, there are plenty of things that Fireslinger kills, which just makes it a reasonable card that is both, easy to kill by your opponent, but also lets you set up a plan where the way you're going to sequence it to be able to deal out damage and take down your opponent's creatures feels really meaningful. A card like Keening Banshee, which gives -2/-2 to a creature, just feels like the right balance where it can actually meaningfully interact with a lot of things, where in a lot of formats, this is a 4-mana 2/2 flyer that gives -2/-2 to a creature, would just be a horrible card and it just wouldn't be able to interact with things. But the fact that it is pretty easy to set up a turn where that can be effective just has really played out well.
Yeah, I feel like this is a great little case study, and a lot of things we harp on a lot on this podcast, like in the case of Keening Banshee or Fireslinger, you designing this environment get to choose exactly how good that is, right? You could choose to put 60% 1 toughness creatures in the battle box and make Fireslinger disgusting. You could choose to put nothing but 1/2s in the battle box and make Fireslinger unplayable, and you have control of that knob of how good you want Fireslinger to be, and keeping that in balance with all the other knobs for all the other cards you're also tuning to try and keep in balance. And also, working in a battle box means that it's a very small environment. Like, how many cards is your battle box? 155, it looks like?
It's about 150, yeah.
Yeah. So, that's a small set of cards. It's not hard for you to look at that and say, all right, which of these cards can Fireslinger kill? Which of them can it kill? Which of these cards is Keening Banshee good against? Which is it bad against? Do a very quick survey and say this card is either effective or not. And if you want to tweak any of these things, it's way easier to do so in an environment like this than it is in a whole cube, where, again, people might never draft Keening Banshee to find out how good it is. People might not draft the things that are good against or bad against Keening Banshee. Here, you have total control over these knobs, which brings me to the last thing this is a great example of, which is playing at a lower power level, because you do have a much wider selection of 4-mana threats with evasion that you could possibly put in that Keening Banshee slot, so that if it turns out Keening Banshee is too good or not good enough, you can tweak it in a lot of ways, either by changing the distribution of all the threats that Keening Banshee could potentially answer, or just by changing the Keening Banshee itself to a new card. So I think this particular box is a great example of all of these facets of cube design, battle box design, sandbox design that we talk about so much.
For sure. So I have 2 other things I want to talk about is changes that I want to make from playing with this new iteration of the box. And then maybe potentially some individual cards that I think have played really well.
Great.
Or maybe are just weird includes. So the first thing, the changes. There are definitely a couple cards here that really stood out as just being a little bit too powerful, but I think in a really specific way, these kind of all manifested. So these are cards like Stir the Sand, which is 6 mana to make 3 zombies, which has cycling and makes 1 zombie, but this is, again, a little bit of that case where it's like, you kind of just want to hang on to that because that's so much value in this context.
Yeah, that 6 mana mode of that spell is definitely one of the most powerful things you can do in this battle box, and so you have to be in a real pinch before I'd be looking to cycle and get that single zombie.
And then Stagger Shock, I think, is the other sort of clearest example of just it's a free 2-for-1. Like we're talking about, the power of these creatures, or the toughness of these creatures, I should say, is all scaled down pretty low. So Stagger Shock, which is a burn spell with rebound, is just a free 2-for-1 basically every time. And these are the kinds of effects that I think lead to the least interesting and meaningful gameplay, where it's just like, well, my opponent drew the free 2-for-1 or free 3-for-1.
Right.
I didn't really have a chance to play around that or navigate this game differently. So those are definitely areas that I'm going to look to change and cut out some of those free 2-for-1s, which, that was definitely a thing I was avoiding, but I did slip up in a couple cases.
It's hard. It's hard to manifest a bunch of values in a selection of cards. I could have just as easily overlooked these because, Stir the Sands was a good card. I remember it being good in Amonkhet Retail Limited, but not necessarily much better than a lot of the cards in this battle box. It's just that the nature of battle box means that guaranteed 3 bodies for 1 card is just a kind of insane rate in an environment where you can always hit your 6 mana drop on turn 6.
Right, and it's really easy to tell yourself a story that this card will work differently. I would be much more excited if it's like, I put this in here because what the lines that are exciting to me are, I'll keep up 4 mana, I'll cycle during your combat step and then be able to block, and I draw my card, and it might still be a 3-for-1, but it's like there was some setup and some choice involved, whereas in reality that just doesn't pan out. And same with Stagger Shock. You can think, well, rebound is cool. I can set up a turn where I get multiple spell triggers and combine multiple burn spells
that
together.
One's a little greedier.
It's a little greedy. I totally agree. But you can see how it wasn't. This card doesn't just say destroy 2 creatures.
Right.
It has a lot of potential for interesting interactions. But when you put it in practice and see how it plays, that just isn't meaningful design space.
It just becomes destroy 2 creatures, yeah.
Another area that I want to change is, this is a very simple change, but I have the 3 tokens, Saprolings, Goblins, and Zombies.
Which pretty good choice for tokens, I would say, overall.
I appreciate that. How do you feel about Goblins?
I mean, I love goblins. I love goblins, but it's not... The goblin token-making cards are not the goblin cards I really love. Like, what I love about the tribe is these, like, quirky, toolboxy small creatures that do odd stuff because goblins are weird. I don't necessarily just love that they make tokens. Again, like, all the goblin token-making spells, not all of them, but very many of them are just completely interchangeable with any other token-making spell. With one that makes soldiers in white or one that makes saplings in green, they're all just spell tokens,
Right. So the problem there is goblins and saprolings are the same token. Nothing here cares about red or green creatures, right. Or, there's maybe some weird tribal thing. There's a couple weird tribal things. So, I want to maximize how much interesting decisions and complexity we have from like the simplest game pieces. So having this complexity that doesn't matter is not great. So I think I'm going to cut all the goblin cards, which I do like, unfortunately, and throw in a couple Thopter tokens. Then I have a 1/1, a 2/2, and a 1/1 flyer. I think that just adds a lot more interesting diversity, and it's going to be good.
Some evasive tokens are good, and I like a lot of the Thopter token generators. I feel like they play in a good space where there's a similar kind of utility where a lot of them, like, it's a creature that gives you a Thopter, and then you can do something else with an artifact or something with a Thopter. It's got this weird kind of relationship. I feel like that'll play well.
The goblin card that I really have enjoyed the most, actually, is you see a pair of goblins from the D&D set, which either lets you pump the power of your whole board or make 2 goblins at instant speed. That's the kind of thing where this is a context where I really like those kinds of modal effects, where you wouldn't necessarily want both of them in any given context, but often one is going to be pretty effective. So I'll be sorry to see that go, but that's how design works.
Yeah, that's the thing, is you got to make compromises. So, did you look at spirit tokens in the spirit of 1/1 flyers? That's the only other token I can think about that I think would be a nice complement to the 2 differently sized ground creatures. And I think if you're worried about being bottlenecked on token generators, I think you're going to find a lot more things that generate spirit tokens than you are Thopter tokens.
That's an interesting idea.
Just
I'll take a look at that.
I'm doing a little backseat designing here.
That's fine. That's called feedback. It's helpful.
Well, to be clear, I think Thopters could be cool, but I don't off the top of my head know what the exact full set of Thopter generating cards that are within this reasonable power level band are.
It's
and
like
it might be
4
narrow.
or 5 cards, really, I think is what we're looking at. But I mean, we don't want a ton of them.
You're only going to want a handful.
How often do you want a Thopter token to be made in a game? Maybe like every other game.
A lot of context writing on that question, I guess, but I think it seems reasonable to do it every once in a while. It seems only worth having the token to me if it's going to happen with enough regularity that the tokens are relevant. Like, If you limit yourself to 3 tokens, but you have 50 Sapperling making cards and 2 Thopter making cards, then what's the point of having a Thopter token? Just get those cards out of there, you know?
Yeah, fair.
It's got to be worth the investment of the unique token.
So then the last change I want to make, and this is a fairly small change, but I think is meaningful, and this is the thing that really takes the most playtesting and just sort of experience to balance, is I do want to cut down a little bit on some of the combat tricks and some of the bounce spells, and maybe some of the more dirtlier stuff, like Wilt is a card. It's a naturalized with cycling. It just never matters. Or when it does, it really matters. How many targets
does it really have in this environment?
Not that many. And that, again, I think that's a good sign to me that the tempo actually is meaningful in this iteration of the box, because it feels very bad to be like, well, I've got to spend 2 mana to cycle this if I want something more relevant.
Right, but that one wouldn't have felt as bad in the old version of the box because 2 free mana was relatively easy to come by there because you had extra time.
And then some, I love things like Think Twice and Radical Idea, stuff like that. Radical Idea especially I like both of them because there's a fair amount of looting here to sort of work with the fact that you have to make a plan out of a bunch of disparate amounts of cards. So having some flexibility that in most games you'll have access to and an effect to be able to discard some cards. But there's maybe just a little bit too high of a proportion of those. And so I might just focus a little bit more on the cards that are impactful to the board.
Think Twice has got to be one of my favorite designs of all time. It's like the complete package for me.
Yeah.
It's so simple. It's got this iconic, very easy to grok mechanic in Flashback. And then the name is just everything. Yeah, think again. Like, it's perfect to me. Also, I feel like very well balanced for a lot of power levels because card draw does scale pretty naturally with the game. Like, I do not think this card would be embarrassing in my own cube. I would put it in decks of my own cube, probably, depending how a draft broke, even though my cube is at the peaks of power level and this battle box is really quite low. But I think it kind of works in both environments. That's a card I love and just am happy to play anywhere. Radical Idea, I do like how it plays out. It is just a lot less clean to me. Like, Jumpstart is a much less knowable mechanic. If you're playing with a new player, they're very unlikely to have seen Jumpstart before, but probably pretty likely to have seen Flashback, if any mechanic. That's like one of the iconic ones. But you're right that trading 1 extra mana on the Flashback to instead exchange a card for it makes that decision perhaps more nuanced, where Think Twice is like, you got the extra mana, get another card. Easy peasy.
The bounce spells are, I think, an especially interesting sort of facet of this, where I really like them. Like Mana War is, I think, a perfect card for Battle Box, and I think it's like a...
Mana War, or ones that don't force you to target your own creature if your opponent has no targets?
I can't not do the Jellyfish. The Jellyfish is so good. It's so classic.
I understand.
So iconic.
And I agree with you. But
the text reads better, even if it is more confusing.
But I'm genuinely curious to know, if you put that all aside, mechanically, what would you prefer for the girls of this box? Would you prefer... I can't remember the name of the wizard from whatever. The same as thing as Mana War.
Exclusion Mage.
Would you prefer that, or would you prefer actual Mana War? Because it does provide additional flexibility in the sense that you might want to bounce your own ETB creature or whatever.
That's the thing, that having the long tail of I bounce something that has another ETB to retrigger it, like that's what I want.
I know that that's your peak area, but then it does have the potential feel bads of
it sure does.
I cast it into my opponent's board and they sacrifice their thing for value with Village Rights or whatever, and then I have to bounce my own creature and did nothing with my turn. You're landing on the Jellyfish.
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Not close.
I think if I was specifically focused on newer players, I might go with the Exclusion Mage instead. But
so
I know it's not your only goal here.
That's not a goal I've stated so far. I definitely want it to be accessible, but this isn't a teaching tool. Like, this is a weird enough format. I'm not going to sit down with somebody who doesn't really grasp the mechanics of Magic and say, let's play some games.
Right. Yeah, it does change enough fundamental rules of it that it could be a very confusing way to introduce people to the game itself.
Yeah.
This last point here, before you get to specific cards, was the thing that I was going to bring up. So we did a little bit of playtesting, and I gave you some feedback about the distribution of cards in my hand.
Feedback. You got very salty.
Well, so I was really experiencing peak Anthony magic. There's not a lot of things you and I see differently in the game, but the one thing I think is very pronounced that we get different amounts of enjoyment out of. How would you even classify this full set of cards? I'm talking about
instant speed interaction.
Okay, that's not a... So here are the cards that over the first 2 games...
Oh, that's what you're pulling up on your phone, your salty list.
I wanted to remember what they were so I didn't mess them all up. In the first 2 games of this battle box, I drew all but one of these cards, and you drew the other one. But this is just 2 games worth of the battle box. Stonecloaker.
Love it.
Core Skyfisher. White Mane Lion.
Great.
Undying Evil.
Amazing.
Teferi's Time Twist.
Perfect.
Plum the Forbidden.
Ooh.
Peel from Reality.
Love it.
All of these are basically the way I would classify them as things that are only good if I have not just an established board, but a particular kind of established board with a particular kind of creature on it. And all of these basically, well, not Core Skyfisher because that's sorcery speed. Everything else says any kind of attempt to interact with my creatures is ill-fated because I have all of these tricky things to do.
Sounds like you were in a great spot. I don't know what you're claiming.
Well, I wasn't, because in the second game I had no creatures in play, and I had a white main line and a Stonecloaker in hand, and it's like, great, I can't cast either of these.
Sure you can. 3 mana, exile a card from graveyard.
They both just bounce themselves on resolution. Now, some of these cards I like more than others. I do really love Peel from Reality. I think it's a really fun card for battle boxes like this. I've talked about cards like Plumb the Forbidden and Undying Evil, though of those set of cards, Plumb the Forbidden is by far my preferred version over a Village Rites.
Really?
For the reasons. Oh, for sure. Absolutely.
So I feel like that's actually the one that I will cut first, just because it might be a little powerful, and the ceiling is very, very high.
Yeah, that's not what I like about it. What I like about it is the
high
better
floor.
Yeah. And to be clear, I think the average case of Plumb the Forbidden is probably worse than Village Rites. Like the median case, I think, is worse. But it does have a higher floor, and it does have a higher ceiling, but that curve is like, it's fatter around the bottom, I'm picturing a curve that it's maybe hard for the listener to hear. And hear that it's got a higher floor and a higher ceiling, but still, on average, is worse than Village Rites. But I think it's actually what it is. Anyway, I was thinking about this some more. And I want to retract a little bit of my... I don't want to retract the saltiness of having Stonecloaker and White Main Line in hand as my only threats, and other combat tricks.
We had some weird draws. That's gonna happen.
And
the other extreme of that is sometimes you have incredible draws, which are just like a blast, where it's like I get to sequence all this stuff.
And to be fair, these were the first 2 games we played, and I was like, oh my god, this whole box is nothing but these effects. And it turned out it was kind of just the first 2 games. We drew most of them in the first 2 games, and the rest of the box kind of had none of these effects left in it because we'd drawn them all out, which is just variance. So I'm not going to retract that completely, because that was not a feel great to have those 2 threats in hand. But I will retract something, which is that I think I need to just change my expectations and assumptions around how the game functions in an environment that you've designed with a lot of these effects in it, right? Because the reason I'm frustrated by them is because the way that I want my players to play Magic and the way that I want to play Magic is like, I want removal to work. That's frankly is what it comes down to. Like, I don't really love...
But you know what's so much fun? When your opponent's removal doesn't work.
It's not fun for me. And the reason it's not fun for me is it's like, these cards only get good when my opponent plays a removal spell. And it's like multiple layers. We've talked about this at length. We don't have to talk about it again. My point is, if I change my assumptions to assume that, okay, removal into an untapped board is just not good here. I should, as a baseline, never remove things into untapped mana, or at least a lot of untapped mana, if it can be avoided. And if I change that assumption, and also change the assumption of like, expecting how blocks are going to go down. Like, basically, like, I think I have to come in with a baseline of like, this is a tricky dicky combat box where stuff just gets all different and wibbly wobbly.
You just can't just... to me, that's so much more interesting than just like, yep, combat it goes one way, and with the exception of lightning bolt, like nothing's going to happen. I don't find that very...
That is an extreme exaggeration of my own cube.
Mm-hmm.
There's quite a few things that do affect combat. First of all, any instant speed removal or interaction at all the burn spells. I do have a couple combat tricks now. I'm not against this completely. What I don't like is it being more likely than not that your opponent's going to be like, ha-ha,
ha-ha, I have magic cards. They do stuff.
Okay, look, so
let's not get into this. Let's just say, maybe compared to the previous iteration, I think this was really a problem in the previous iteration, and it was especially a problem because of the tempo of the box. It just allowed you to play into these way too much. So players would just sit there and be like, I'll play a threat, they'll play a threat, I'm not really going to attack.
Could I have played both Stonecloaker and White Main Lion? Like, played White Main Lion? No, because I play White Main Lion, and then while it's on the stack, whole priority play Stonecloaker.
At least White Main Lion doesn't target, it just says, do it.
Right, that's true. I mean, they don't enter the battlefield simultaneously. There's no way I can cast them so they enter the battlefield simultaneously.
Correct.
So I can't get them to, like, both bounce the White Main Line or something. Anyway, I'm sorry. I got distracted for a moment there.
So, but I think because the tempo matters a lot here. So the problem was you'd get into these board states where it's like no one would really be able to attack, and then suddenly you'd have this one big turn where both players would be like, I guess this is the turn I attack, and both players would just reveal their 3 combat tricks, and we'd figure out who wins, which is fun once or twice, but it wasn't great.
Munchkins vibes.
Munchkins. That's a really good descriptor.
Some people love Munchkins.
I enjoy Munchkins once or twice.
Once you've had 6 or 7 drinks.
Yes. 4 to 12.
Lower floor, higher ceiling.
Lower floor, higher ceiling. But here, because I think that you actually are putting meaningful pressure on your opponents, like if you're choosing to keep up a combat trick on defense, like that's a big choice. It actually is meaningful. And so I don't think you get to those really degenerate states. But I see what you're saying, and we can push it a little bit further in that direction.
I'm not
a little bit.
I'm not requesting any changes. But it had the
You're not pulling a I will never play this cube
I will
until
never do this again until this card is cut. No, I'm not requesting any changes. I'm just noting my response to my hand being full of nothing but these cards, and the fact that maybe with some changed expectations, I could enjoy them a little more. The other thing that gets me about them is that like they smack of a modal card, but they're really not a modal card. They're actually like a very narrow card where it's like it's good in kind of exactly one situation. But the fact that it's like, ooh, I could retrigger any ETB or I could target any creature makes it feel like this is a cool card with lots of different modes. And it's like it's got the one mode. It's like blow your opponent out if they try and target your stuff with other stuff.
There's depth there. Try I think honestly, Stonecloaker specifically
That's
in
a powerful
games I've
card
played,
in this
I've usually
box.
just played it on turn 3 and like just paid like treat it as written as that is an additional cost. And now I have a 3 power flyer and that is extremely powerful.
A 3 power flyer at instant speed. Like I think Stonecloaker is powerful enough, right? It's not the power level I'm complaining about. I don't think these cards in my hand were bad per se. It's the play patterns I was like, ugh. I would love, is there not a cheap white main lion sized thing that has the option of bouncing something? I know obviously it's a downside as well as an upside, right? Like the whole point of white main lion being a 2-mana 2/2 with flash is that that's a very good base stat line for like a retail limited for a common. The downside is that you can't just play it that way. You have to bounce something else. And it's fun to try and turn that into an upside for some people. Is there a card that makes it actually more modal, where it's like, if you want to play this as just a threat, you can. If you want to play it as a way to interact with the interaction, you can also do that. Is that a class of cards that you've looked at or that exists?
I think it does exist.
Because I've always said that like that's why I really like Restoration Angel in this kind of slot. Obviously, completely different power level. But Restoration Angel as a 4-mana 3/4 flyer with flash, it's just a card you will very often just flash in because your opponent didn't do anything relevant and you're just going to flash it into attack next turn. You can't do that with these cards. These cards, you have to get your opponent, otherwise you're not doing what the card does, you know?
I can't budge on White Mane Lion or Mana War.
Okay.
Those two are...
I'm not complaining about Mana War, to be clear. I prefer for myself the Mana War play patterns. I just didn't know if you often have an eye to less enfranchised players. I was wondering if that was setting off a little alarm for you, the fact that it does have perhaps unintuitive negative play patterns.
It has unintuitive negative play patterns, but if you don't know about them, you just don't see them. They're invisible.
I mean, and then sometimes you do. Sometimes you're like, I'll curve my 2 into my 3-drop, and my opponent hasn't played a threat yet. It's like, guess what? You don't do that. You lose now.
I'm okay with that.
Okay, sure. Fair.
That rare, brutal experience.
Fair.
You want to talk about a couple cards that I just think stand out as being particularly successful?
Single card discussion.
So this one I'm not sure if we're going to agree on, because I was actually pretty shocked. So there's a little bit of lag between when I designed this list and then actually got the list together in paper.
These are cards you think you're noting them because they have been playing particularly well, as in they're powerful and effective, or you just have enjoyed the play patterns?
I enjoyed the play patterns
of. Cool. Just so we set expectations.
So, Spirit Mantle. This is 1 and a white.
That is surprising.
Enchanted creature gets +1/+1 and has protection from creatures. I was surprised. I was like, I put this in here? Were you surprised by this card?
I mean, I think you told me about it before we played.
Okay.
So, no, I was not surprised because you told me it was coming. I am shocked that of all the cards Magic has to offer, you picked 155 for this battle box with these design considerations, and you were like, you know what? Spirit Mantle. Now, first, what I like about it, it does provide a new, like all the cards I listed earlier, like kind of the same card, pretty much, and variations of the same card. Spirit Mantle is a very different card than any other card in your battle box, and that's fun. I think having a range of effects in a box like this is really engaging and makes it fun to like see novel combinations of cards. If you have a bunch of cards that are practically or almost functionally interchangeable, they're almost fungible, then it's like you're kind of playing with a smaller box, right?
Right.
So I like that about it. I also like that it kind of has like, dare I say it, like Baneslayer Angel vibes.
Baneslayer.
Obviously, you can play nothing and then attack, but I don't think the play pattern of like Voltron or like put a lot of eggs in one basket is inherently an unfun play pattern, and this is an interesting way to include something like that without just putting in a big 6-mana creature with dice removal or whatever your similar way to approach that would be.
Right. I think what it does is, just like you're describing it, it's nice in this really, really tiny dose where it comes up every once in a while. It really dramatically shifts the game. It asks for a completely different kind of answer. You can't just block with your creatures anymore. It does reward you for sequencing things. It rewards you for trying to bait out your opponent's removal and just being able to set up a way to win. It breaks through board stalls. It just really, I think in a way that is not as swingy as it looks at first, just changes the texture of games. That I like having that as an occasional thing.
I'm almost less worried about when it's good and more worried about when it's bad. An aura that maybe does nothing is kind of rough if you're on the back foot. It's like, well, I make a good blocker and hope that you have no interaction.
I've seen it happen.
Yeah, I think it's going to be a swingy card, and you, of course, are the only one equipped to decide how swingy is the right amount of swingy, but I don't hate it. I don't hate it as much as you might think I would hate it.
Great. All right, Nantuko Husk. I love this card. I mean, it's iconic, it's classic. It's 2 and a black for a 2/2. Sacrifice a creature. Nantuko Husk gets +2/+2. And I think this does a really similar thing where it just demands a different kind of answer. You can no longer chump block this threat.
I would argue you definitely can chump block it. That's in fact the one thing you can do in Nantuko Husk.
Sure, but like you
can't
then,
trade in combat with it.
Right. You're then in the abyss. It just allows your opponent to say like, well, you have a 2/2. I'm going to trade my 1/1s for your 2/2. And I just think that's great. It really rewards you for sequencing well, but it also can be really punishing. So again, like you're saying, you don't want to just sacrifice your board when your opponent has open mana because there is a fair amount of interaction that can really blow you out. So I'm really happy with how this plays. And the fact that this is a card that I enjoy playing with and I just enjoy aesthetically, I'm happy that it is powerful.
This one is in my original like core set battle box as well, because I had a little bit of wanting to just play iconic cards in that battle box, and so Nantuko has made the cut on those grounds. I'm glad it's effective here. I have yet to cast it. I don't think either of us cast it in any of the games we played. I think it just ended up in our hands at the end of the game or something. But it strikes me as a card that will have swingy moments similarly. Again, you're behind, you draw Nantuko Husk. It's like, okay, well, 3 mana 2/2.
Yeah.
Hill Giant. Right, is that Hill Giant? No, that's 4 mana 3/3. Gray Ogre. I did it. Gray Ogre, that's not the best stat line necessarily, but yeah, I'm glad it's working out.
How do you feel about Radiant Flames? This is 3 mana. Radiant Flames deals X damage to each creature, where X is the number of colors spent to cast it.
I really like it. I think it's extraordinarily too powerful for this box, and the most powerful card, bar none, and it's not close. Because the fact that it is effectively a board wipe. We talked about how Stagger Shock is basically a guaranteed 2-for-1 here because of the spread of power and toughness on this across this box. Similarly, Radiant Flames is going to kill almost anything you want at 3. The nature of the mana in battle box is you can always cast it for 3 different colors of mana if you want. I love that it's scalable. I just think it's a little too much maybe for this environment, but I like the card a lot. I think it's a fantastic battle box card.
Yeah, I think it's reasonable to tolerate in the box this size 1 or 2 Wraths. I really like the sort of opportunity for players to feel like they can sort of sculpt how they're using this and craft a game plan around it. And I've had some really exciting moments with this card where
it's definitely exciting.
I was actually able to like get into combat, deal some damage to some of my opponent's defender, and then equip my creatures and put a counter here, and then cast it for red in order to deal 1 and like Plague Wind my opponent. And like that's the ceiling in terms of interesting decisions and like complexity. But the floor is this is just a Wrath and just kills everything all the time.
Yeah. And to be clear, that's why I think that floor plus the upside of, and sometimes it's way better than a Wrath, is why I think it's too good. I don't think having a Wrath is too good in this box. Like you said, have that in your opening hand, you can play to that potential eventuality. I do think it's beneficial when we're having these conversations to like distinguish, because what you described is an interesting kind of decision, but it's not really to me a strategic decision. Like obviously the strategy is kill my opponent's creatures and keep mine.
You think it's more just like a puzzle?
It's a puzzle.
Decision, like,
it's a puzzle where it's
out?
like, can I thread the needle and get these things to line up in such a way that I get to do this thing? It's not a strategy in terms of like, what should I do? And I guess in my own cube, I have put a lot more priority on the strategic decisions. Like, what is the correct choice here? I have multiple options. Which one is correct? Which one increases my win percentage? As opposed to, here's a puzzle for you to solve, which is not to say that's any worse or less interesting or whatever, or less, intellectually challenging. But I do think that we don't often talk about the distinction between those kinds of choices, and they are different. You want to turn Radiant Flames into a board wipe, and if you can negotiate the board into a way to do so, that's great for you as the player. I don't think that's the same kind of decision we talk about when we talk about, like, here's a removal spell, what are you going to remove? That's a strategic decision to me.
I think that's maybe a spectrum, but I definitely agree with those.
It's definitely related, right?
Points.
Because you can take the same board and say, okay, I can cast Radiant Flames for 1 and kill these things we both have, or 2. Like, you could decide
and the decision
strategically
which can I actually afford to just do nothing for 3 turns and then try and dismantle your board? And is my opponent going to play around me not doing anything and actually not overextend? Like, I think there is space in between, but I do agree that those core concepts play into each kind of like decision space.
Right. And it's not that Radiant Flames is a purely puzzle kind of decision space card. It's that sometimes it is the way you describe. Sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's, all right, which of these modes am I going to choose? None of them is obviously better than any other. It's not like any of them are a Plague Wind. In both situations, we all lose some creatures. which board state do I want the most to advance my game plan, that is a strategic decision. So it's just different kinds of decisions you can possibly lead your players to.
Right. Treetop Ambusher is a cool little card that I feel like is very unassuming, but just have enjoyed having it in my hand every time I've played it in this box. This is 1 and a green for a 2/1. Whenever it attacks, target a creature you control gets +1/+1 until end of turn. It also has dash, so you can cast it for its dash cost, it gets haste, and then you return it after combat. Just a 2-mana 2/1 at its floor is, kind of a fine card on rate in this box. Actually, again, I like the fact that it only has 1 toughness because a lot of other cards can interact with it. So I'm really, thinking about these as
can't dash it into a
game
fire
pieces.
slinger.
Yeah, you can't dash into a fire slinger and it dies to a sapperling. And then just interacting in combat, being able to pump up different creatures in different ways. Sometimes maybe, chump attacking with this in order to get an extra power in your flyer. There's just a lot of nice little, maybe it is more puzzly space, but I enjoy the way this card plays a good deal.
I love this card. I think it's great.
A card that stuck around actually not many cards stuck around from the previous iteration for all these reasons we've been talking about. One that I loved in the previous iteration and I love here is Cassili Pride Mage. A different cat. Apparently I like cats in Magic. Cassili Pride Mage, classic card. Green-white for a 2/2 with Exalted, and pay 1 and sacrifice to destroy an artifact or enchantment. Exalted just plays out so much better than you think, being able to just cast
Do you think it plays bad?
I think that a lot of people would, when they first read it, think of it as a downside mechanic that you want to not attack with your... Because it prevents you from attacking with multiple creatures.
It doesn't.
But I mean, if you want the trigger...
I like Cassili Pride Mage. I think this is real tippy top of the power level spectrum here.
Oh, I agree.
This is a great place to highlight the fact that gold cards are at no cost in Battle Box, right? This is no harder to cast than any other 2-drop in the entire box. So you have to compare it to every other 2-drop, even one that is only in 1 color and has generic mana. I mean, it's not entirely true. It's a little easier to multi-spell later on with cards with generic mana and their mana cost, but for the most part, it's pretty much on par. And the fact that this is a 2-mana 2/2 with Exalted and this upside, I think it's really strong.
It is, yeah. I mean, combining with creatures with evasion, the fact that it can interact with artifacts and enchantments, I think there's just, from a card that is fairly simple, leads to lots of opportunities for interactions with other cards, and that's really what I'm looking for.
This is a great example, too, of not just the puzzle kind of solving, like, oh, this card cares about its power, so if I pump it with Exalted, then it does another thing, but also strategically, like, do I want to go wide, do I want to go tall? I think it's a very interesting question. I might even pose that perhaps Exalted will just always play really well in battle boxes specifically because you're inherently drawing from decks with the exact same power toughness distribution. And oftentimes, 1 additional power toughness over the average is what makes a huge difference in whether or not your attack is a clean 1-for-1 trade or a 2-for-1 because they have to double block.
Yeah, that's a great point. One other card here, I really enjoyed Ginger Brute. I feel like this is a card that, in all kinds of contexts, people have just enjoyed more and more, and here, again, it's like a cool kind of evasion. It's another cheap threat, and it even has this extra relevance of gaining use from life potentially in the late game, which can matter here.
I hate this card.
Really?
I don't know why. I just don't like it. Well, I guess I kind of know why.
Nowhere.
It's like, it's too cute.
It's very cute.
It's too cute. It's like, that's so fast. You can't catch it unless you're fast. It's so... I mean, it's a fine card in terms of its play patterns. I think it's got a lot of text on it. Like, it's pretty complicated, but... For some reason, that card has never sparked joy for me since the day I first saw it printed.
Just saying. Give the cookie a sword and let him go to town.
If you give a sword a cookie and you give a moose a muffin.
Yeah, that's it. So one other sort of change from the previous box that you've reminded me of that I think has made it played a lot better is I was a little bit interested in sort of stretching the mana system and forcing you to make decisions about how you sequence your lands a little bit too much in the first iteration, I've realized, for my taste. So I cut back. It can be a
little punishing sometimes.
Yeah, I cut back on a lot of the gold cards and avoided multi-pip cards pretty heavily. So I think there is still a meaningful decision space where you're figuring out how to sequence your lands, and it's
Great
not
example
just
of a puzzle decision, not a strategic decision.
Right.
Well, I guess if you have two equivalent things where it's like, which one do I want to cast next turn, that becomes a strategic decision. If it's just, but I think more often it's just, which land am I supposed to play to maximize the number of cards I could potentially cast on future turns is what you're usually doing. And that's very much a bookkeeping, like, all right, well, I'll figure out my mana symbols.
Right. So I think there is like the right amount of bookkeeping for my taste in this iteration where it does still like you're making a decision which is going to impact future turns, and how to try and optimize that is meaningful and interesting, but it's not overwhelming and it doesn't dominate too much of the game. So I'm pretty happy with where things are in that regard.
Yeah, I will say that one of the perennial and I think unavoidable or more or less unavoidable downsides of BattleBox, one of the worst experiences is getting punished by playing a land that you had no information about. Like,
Right.
You have a hand which you can cast all of the cards in, and you have to just play a random tap land, and you like play the one that has the most mana symbols you don't have in play or is tied for that. And then you draw a double pip spell in another dual lands color, and you're like, all right, well, now I can't play this card because I just happened to get punished. That's just how BattleBox works. That's the nature of this kind of mana system. It happens in regular Magic too, but it feels especially pronounced here because you do have all 5 colors of mana, so the chances of you accidentally playing the wrong land, I say accidentally, you had no control over it, so it doesn't really seem fair to call it an accident. The chance of you incidentally playing the wrong land, it does happen sometimes, which is just kind of a bummer.
Right, and some people I know do like to lean into that feature of the environment and say, like, let's play Leatherback Baloth and give players this choice of, do you want to play a bunch of green lands at the sacrifice of not being able to optimize the rest of your hand for this reward? And I definitely get the appeal of that, but in practice, it's just like, well, that's just kind of a punishing decision, and I don't want to make it.
I like it in very, very, very small amounts in my main battle box. Mainly, I have like limited power outliers to cards that are like triple pipped. Like I have Kiki Jiki in that box, which is kind of egregious on power level, but you have to have all 3 of your red sources in play in order to cast it, and 2 of them come into play tapped. So if you have it in your opening hand, it's going to affect your early sequencing, and if you draw it late, it's very unlikely you're just going to be able to cast it immediately. And so it does make you make those decisions, but I wouldn't want every game to be about those kinds of mana negotiations.
Right, I agree. So that's my battle box update. I'm pretty happy with where it is. It's in a convenient portable box that I can maybe one day take to the local game store again, and I'm looking forward to it.
It sounds great, and it plays great. I've played it, and I think it's great. And we've talked about it for so long, we're not even going to talk about my battle box at all. So listeners have to stay tuned with bated breath. Here's a good opportunity. If you're listening to this right now and you're on the social media or the Reddit or the Discord or whatever, do you want us to talk about my battle box soon? Or are you done with battle box and you want us to spread out the battle box talk and talk about it much later? It's up to you, listener, to decide.
Would you call that a strategic decision, or is that more of a puzzle decision?
That's a strategic decision, for sure.
Okay.
What do you want, Puzzle decision would be like, we are going to talk about battle box for sure in the next 6 weeks. And we have Kamigawa Neon Dynasty coming out on this date, and we're going to have this many shows about Kamigawa Neon Dynasty. Where do we fit it in, right? That's the puzzle decision. Thank you for tuning into Lucky Paper Radio. All of our music is produced by DJ James Nasty. All of the Magic cards are produced by Wizards of the Coast. This podcast is produced by thinking about Magic cards, maybe playing with them a little bit, and then talking into microphones about them. Thank you, Anthony, for building a delightful battle box.
Thanks for only getting a little bit salty about it.
Just a little salty about Stonecloaker, White Mane Lion. Like, I just looked at them and
You taught me about Stonecloaker. You showed me this card.
Well, yeah, I was like, oh, you like White Mane Lion? Here's a much cooler version. It's like Daniel and the cooler Daniel, but you keep playing Daniel, too. That's a meme. I'm not making fun of our friend Daniel. You don't know memes. The Daniel, cooler Daniel meme, everyone knows what I'm talking about, except for you.
Just like they know about Metal Gear Solid clapping.
Hey, one person specifically, Scott Burtz, I know really appreciated that. And that's what I make my intros for. Just that one person out there. It's going to get all the layers of the reference. I'm going to show you the Daniel, cooler Daniel meme. It's very funny.
Preparing to receive meme.
This is very good. I don't know the provenance of this. I don't know how it originated. But people use this as a meme template, though, to compare 2 things where one is the same but cooler.
Yeah.
It's good, right?
Uh-huh.
How did this person work on the...
They work on the yearbook.
They work on the yearbook.
Yeah, this is a thing that kids these days don't know about.
The yearbook?
The yearbook. And
it was like Facebook, but
team,
it had less COVID misinformation and racist family members.
And apparently,
the cooler Daniel. Then it's like you're kind of playing with a smaller box, right?
Right.
That was a weird sentence. Anyway.
No, we got it.
Anyway,